Hello, my name is Ed Hahn, and I'm with the Airline Pilots Association. I am a senior engineer in engineering and air safety, and I am also a chair of the RTCA Special Committee 242 on spectrum compatibility, and also a member of the RTCA Program Management Committee.
And good day to everyone. My name is Andrew Roy from Aviation Spectrum Resources. I'm the Director of Engineering there. I'm also the chair of the ICAO Frequency Spectrum Management Panel, and I'm a member of the Program Management Committee at RTCA also.
So this morning, thank you for joining us, first of all, for getting a primer on what spectrum is and why there's been a controversy over the last several years on a couple of different fronts. And the format we're going to take today is we're going to kind of do a tag team interview. I'm going to start by asking Andy some questions about spectrum, and then halfway through, he's going to turn the tables on me and ask some additional questions. Without further ado, we'll start with the first question, which is, what is the radio spectrum and how does aviation use it?
So it sounds like a very simple question, but it has a lot of nuance and complexity. So let me try and work through it over a couple of minutes to explain it. But the best way I've found at least of describing spectrum is it's effectively an infrastructure needed for all wireless systems to operate. You really need to have it to be able to transmit in a planned and agreed manner with suitable boundaries. It's less relevant today, but people were generally familiar with this without realizing it previously with FM radio stations. You tune to a station between 88 or 108 and listen to your station. And 88 to 108 megahertz is generally the international allocation for FM radio broadcasts. So you need to have something agreed and planned in advance to operate. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. If you transmit in an area where you shouldn't be, firstly, you're an illegal broadcaster, as it's called. And secondly, and particularly more important for aviation, if we're not operating in bands that are appropriately protected and allocated for aviation safety services, we cannot claim protection either from interference. And that's very important, especially with the FM broadcast example, because aviation has VOR and ILS usage just above the 108 megahertz. So we obviously want to make sure the FM broadcast below that boundary is operating appropriately and in the bands it says it should do. To make all this work, we use a process called spectrum management to try and ensure everything can operate in the appropriate area. Now, to make this a little bit easier, what we've got in advance is called a spectrum frequency allocation table chart. This is a chart that is going to come up now from the US. The way we make all this work together is a process called spectrum management. Spectrum management allows us to basically put all these things together in different areas to make them work together. And as you can see from the online chart that we pulled up there today, these different colors are different spectrum uses, whether it's Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G, 5G communications, aviation, of course, satellites, science services, and so forth. There's multiple different uses, but they all need to work together, and that's the process of spectrum management. And the best, if slightly imperfect, analogy to this is real estate or land use zoning. You want to ensure that you have appropriate land use and its neighbors are appropriate to that use as well. To do an extreme example, having an all-night karaoke bar next to a monastery that's had a vow of silence, they're not going to be very good neighbors for obvious reasons. So you want to ensure that that is managed appropriately in land zoning, and the same for spectrum as well. Very loud or noisy neighbors really shouldn't be next to very quiet neighbors that need that level of assurance. So spectrum management tries to do the same as land zoning, regulations and assessments for how either cohabitants or neighbors can work alongside each other effectively and still achieve what they want to do. And when you consider this can be quite varied in spectrum with the multiple needs and different technologies from industries that are out there. As I mentioned before, Wi-Fi, 3G to 4G, 5G, and aviation and science services all have different requirements, different uses, even down to some are communications and some are navigational systems as well. So very much needs to work together to go for it. The complexity with this as well is that there is no new spectrum available. What you see there is what is available. Like land, mostly, it's limited to what you've got and how you can use it. That means effectively you want to grow wireless applications and have more spectrum, either you need to reuse it, and a good example would be cellular systems. Having more cellular towers closer together means they can reuse those frequencies more often, or you need to repurpose it, finding a user that either no longer needs their spectrum or can find a way of doing it somewhere else. For example, sending the information via a fiber optic system means you can repurpose that spectrum going forward. But as all industries are trying to grow their spectrum use, because wireless use is growing everywhere for all industries and everyone wants to have wireless function these days, it does introduce a certain competitive element as well between the different users, because everyone wants new spectrum to grow their user base and their applications. From an aviation perspective, aviation is very much a wireless industry. We don't sell tickets on kites for obvious reasons. We don't have cables flying through the air across the North Atlantic. We need to have a dedicated allocation of spectrum for all our comms, nav, and surveillance functions, specifically allocated towards that purpose. And to give you an example of what we do here, you'll see on the chart the inclusion of our comms functions throughout that range, our navigational systems in purple, surveillance, and then lastly, maybe not dedicated aviation spectrum, but stuff that modern aviation relies on significantly through supporting systems. For example, SATCOM to aircraft to allow Wi-Fi in the cabin for passengers is a very modern function that we need a spectrum for these days as well in aviation. At the same time as well, aviation's requirement is that we have a globally harmonized use as well. We do not want to have 5 different radios that you have to switch on and switch off as you fly over different countries. So making sure we have the same thing everywhere in a consistent manner through the global standardization process as well, but through spectrum is key to ensure that we can operate safely is our primary concern going forward, but also effectively as well in an economic manner at the same time. So that's generally how spectrum works. There's a lot more nuance to it, but that's a very good overview of the different aspects to consider in how spectrum is put together and how it works.
Okay, obviously that was a pretty complex chart, and if these things need to work internationally, can you describe who is involved with the allocation of spectrum internationally?
So the international element, just to step back 2 paces, has a very much a function on the national focus as well. So what you'll have is international organizations, generally under the UN, setting rules and standards, and then that'll be implemented nationally. And to use our aviation example, ICAO sets its own rules and standards through Annex 10, Annex 14, and so forth. And then the FAA will look to implement them nationally. And a very similar thing happens with spectrum as well at the international level. So some of you may be familiar with an organization called the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, and they generate a worldwide table of allocations as part of their process in an international UN treaty document called the Radio Regulations. And it's very similar text version, but very similar to the chart we've just seen there for the US national process that defines where things work and how it should operate. The ITU is based in Geneva, 193 member states and over 750 private sector entities and academic institutions also participate. And what they're trying to do is several roles. Firstly, promote the shared global use of radio spectrum, also facilitate the international cooperation in assigning satellite orbits, and assist also in developing and coordinating worldwide technical standards. Now, the best way for the ITU, focusing on the spectrum side here, is that high-level coordination and limitations. It's not trying to set the exact specifics for how each system should operate, but it's setting that coordination and limitations to ensure systems can operate internationally and then allow individual states under their own sovereign rights to implement specific rules for those systems to operate, such as licensing and so forth. The Satellite Constellation Registry is a great example for satellite orbits. Satellites are not limited to national boundaries, obviously. They have global or significant regional coverage that needs to be considered. So the ITU will help establish the coordination thresholds and the processes required for the satellite constellation to launch and operate. And then individual states will then license those operations within their own territories to make sure they do work with what that state wants to do. When you consider how other agencies in the UN also organize, ICAO is obviously well known for aviation as a sister, a UN agency to the ITU. And the way ICAO interfaces on this is it provides expertise on aviation operations and systems. So the ITU is responsible for spectrum interaction between different systems across multiple different users and nations. But ICAO will provide the expertise, particularly on the aviation operations and its systems under its own standards process to make sure that's an informed process going forward. The main focus of a lot of this work from ICAO going into the ITU is what's known as the World Radio Communications Conference, the WRC. This is a huge conference, 4 weeks at a time, every 3 to 5 years, and that is the conference that decides what changes should be made to this UN treaty, the radio regulations we discussed. The agenda is agreed at the previous WRC, and that 3 to 5 years allows a lot of groundwork to be developed to build the necessary information. So decisions at the next WRC are an informed process that can then amend this UN treaty for those frequency use tables. ICAO obviously participates in this. It provides its own system details as required when there's an aviation interest, and it also provides a position as well to the WRC on what it thinks is the best way of solving the agenda items that have been raised. Now, I would say, although the ICAO and ITU like to work together very effectively, it doesn't always mean ICAO's position to the ITU is always what happens. It depends on the administrations and the member states and how they agree to move forward the treaty. But ICAO does have a lot of weight in the ITU, and it's ensuring that the position is appropriate to the agenda items to ensure aviation globally has what it needs to operate safely and effectively going forward.
So we've talked about international. How does this work at the national level? And what are the differences between different countries?
So once these changes have been approved at the radio regs, these are then implemented in some form by the different member states. Now, as I mentioned, member states are sovereign entities, so they can actually, if they want to, choose to go what's outside of the radio regs if they really feel they need to. But obviously the caveat to that is the ITU, through the radio regulations, has set the framework, and really they should ensure that they're not affecting other states in a negative manner. Now, the way of dealing with this is cross-coordination with your neighbors, effectively across borders. And that can be easy or hard depending on the geography of the individual countries. The US, which is a comparatively big country with only 2 main borders on it, is actually quite an easy process to do that comparatively. Coordination with 2 different entities with a large landmass is actually a fairly, comparatively at least, simple process. It's not simple in what actually happens, but compared to others, especially when you start looking to countries and regions where not only would you have to coordinate with your immediate neighbor, but your radio signals could affect your neighbor's neighbor going forward. And that's where you see a lot of regional agreements for countries with lots of borders in close proximity. And Europe is the great example of that with the European Commission. You do not want to have to do individual agreements with 10, 20, 30 different nations. Having a framework and an overarching organization regionally to help coordinate that is significantly better. So once it comes down to the national level, you'll have different organizations at that national level that will then do it. The national spectrum regulators will look, as I said, at the radio regulations and see how and what they're going to implement in their different administrations. And very similar to how the ITU and ICAO interact is very similar often to the national level as well. You'll have your FAA or EASA, to use a couple examples, will interface with the national spectrum regulators and provide them their inputs, their expert agencies in their domain and what they think would be appropriate. And that should normally work out reasonably well on what's happening. The US has an interesting arrangement. It's not unique, but it's unusual in comparison to a lot of different nations where we have 2 different spectrum regulators in the US. The FCC is an independent agency regulating spectrum for industry participants. It also does a lot of other functions, but we're just going to stick at a high level to domestic spectrum management here. And then NTIA regulates spectrum for federal agencies. So the US Department of Defense, NASA, and the FAA come under NTIA. And those then 2 agencies, FCC and NTIA, then work together through MOUs and other processes to try and ensure national spectrum issues are coordinated and then implemented in an appropriate manner. I highlight the US model because a lot of other nations normally have a single spectrum regulator that will deal with both their federal or government agencies and the private industry at the same time. But still, the process is the same, with often their civil aviation authority providing input and necessary skill sets to hopefully achieve a good spectrum outcome for aviation in that particular example. So I think I've talked enough. So I'm going to turn the tables, as Ed mentioned at the start here, and start asking him some questions that have sort of been raised in the various processes and so forth. So Ed, from your perspective, what does the aviation industry need from spectrum? And we have obviously multiple entities here. We have pilots, airlines, manufacturers, and passengers. What do you think the aviation needs from spectrum to achieve what it needs to do?
Those are great questions. So I think let's start with the passengers. I think it's pretty clear that they want to reach their destination on time and safely. Over the past 50 years, the safety aspect has been made pretty clear to Congress and the White House that plane crashes are unacceptable. And we've even seen in the recent past what happens if passengers do not feel safe flying. As a result, the public has an expectation that the FAA will act swiftly and strongly to ensure safety. And as a byproduct of that, we think it's very clear that the aviation industry has to do everything that it can to maintain its exceptional modern safety record. When we talk about pilots and airlines, so the pilots are trained to trust their instruments. There isn't an interference warning light on board that goes off if they encounter RF interference. And the airplane is not instrumented to measure the RF environment looking for interference. And so if the pilot does encounter interference, it's likely that they won't even know it. What they'll see is some system behaves in an anomalous fashion. And therefore they're kind of left scratching their heads as to what exactly happened. And they worry about it after the fact. They, priority, of course, is keep the airplane flying. The problem is compounded, especially with modern airplanes, because the RF systems are pretty deeply integrated. So, for example, interference with a GPS or a radar altimeter is going to affect much more than just a map display or an altitude readout. Modern airplanes, their flight controls change the airplane's handling qualities based on, for example, how close they are to the runway. Systems like thrust reversers, ground spoilers, and auto brakes may not function normally in the presence of interference, based on incorrect data being generated and sent onto those systems. And then finally, we have safety systems like the terrain awareness and warning system that's based on both the GPS and radar altimeter inputs. This system has likely saved hundreds of lives over the last couple of decades. In fact, we can say that there has not been a single passenger fatality due to what's called controlled flight into terrain on a US or Canadian airliner that's been equipped with TAWs. If we contrast that, prior to the introduction of that system, controlled flight into the terrain was the leading cause of aviation fatalities. And so, we definitely don't want to take a step back when it comes to ensuring the safety of flight. And then further back in the chain, what do the manufacturers want? Well, they want a controlled and consistent spectrum environment. The airlines purchase airliners with the expectation that they're going to be in service for 25 to 30 years. Most of the avionics on board the airplane is not replaced during that time. And in general, replacements are not currently routine parts of the airplane's life cycle. A manufacturer, therefore, needs to be able to build a system with some confidence that the equipment is going to last for that long. And if there is a need to change how that works, because, for example, aviation has not upgraded their systems on a 10-year basis or something like that. If that becomes necessary due to rapid changes in the spectrum environment, then the industry is really going to need some time to adjust how it does things like capital planning to make sure that they can accommodate that more frequent upgrade to the aviation equipment.
Great. So you did mention several systems in there as well. So one of the questions that often comes up is, aviation has been involved in a lot of spectrum issues recently. GPS, SATCOM, radar altimeters, DME as well. What have those been, and is there a common thread to those spectrum issues that aviation has faced recently?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that other industries really don't understand aviation's requirements for safety and what that means from a spectrum, compatibility standpoint. And this is pretty clear in what they say, publicly even. So, for example, we've seen other industries comment that aviation is always assuming the worst case when performing safety analysis. In other industries, for example, a 95% probability of a successful data packet transmission is a typical performance target. And there's the luxury that if the transmission fails, they just retransmit the packet. When aviation relies on its instruments, for example, to allow for an automatic landing in poor weather conditions, they need to ensure that an accident has a 1 in a billion chance or less of happening, because there is no backup. You don't get another chance to try to do it again, if the airplane flares at the wrong altitude above the runway. Another challenge is, aviation has airplanes that fly and they actually move pretty quickly. Airplanes are by their nature pretty much always in motion. And even when you include rotorcraft, they could be operating anywhere from as low as 500 feet altitude or less, potentially at hundreds of miles per hour. This kind of moving target makes it difficult to perform interference analysis, where typically when you do these analyses, the transmitter and receiver are assumed to be stationary relative to one another. Even in the mobile wireless world, they're moving at relatively low speeds compared to what airplanes do. So wrapping that up, I think, there's an opportunity for the FCC to try to take advantage of aviation's expertise and how they've evolved the system to be safe, and to understand why aviation needs those protections when it comes to operating their RF equipment.
So you mentioned there about an education and understanding piece, and certainly an advocacy component as well. How do you think the aviation industry can advocate for spectrum issues effectively?
So aviation is at this point in time in its history is very much a data-driven industry. The protection and promotion of aviation spectrum needs to have the underlying data that supports the arguments. And that includes the standards development activities that RTCA and EUROCAE perform. Those need to contain, specific technical performance requirements to be able to function properly. As we will hear on Wednesday morning session, aviation is already taking steps to get a handle on where our systems stand today in this evolving world, where we expect the spectrum demand to continue to increase, and it's unlikely to slow in the foreseeable future, and essentially position aviation such that it's prepared for future analysis that is going to be necessary to ensure that aviation systems can coexist safely with new entrants in adjacent bands. But it doesn't just stop there. As mentioned already, aviation has a pretty long history of learning lessons, and these aren't really understood by those outside of our industry. Aviation's users, and I'm including pilots, the passenger and cargo airlines, air taxi, the rotorcraft community, that includes the UAS world, and general aviation needs to become more aware of what spectrum activities are brewing, and what credible effects that might, cause on aviation operations. And, as a community, we need to be prepared to speak to both the aviation safety regulator as well as the spectrum regulators and why it is vital for aviation spectrum to be protected. This education is going to be critical. And furthermore, we need to do this because we know that other industries are talking to their spectrum regulators every day. We need to be there so that they hear the full story. And again, the point of this is not to stifle innovation. Certainly the UAS community is an example of innovation within aviation, but really it's to find a path forward where industries can work in adjacent bands without interfering with each other, and also ensuring that safety and the business at hand can proceed.
Great, thank you, Ed. I think that's all the questions we had for today to do a primer for the Spectrum incoming Spectrum Summit starting on December the 13th. I would encourage everyone to visit RTC and EUROCAE for details, and on screen now there is also a URL to register. There's going to be lots of discussions on Spectrum over 2 days, both from aviation and non-aviation participants to discuss this very important topic, and we certainly look forward to it. But thank you, Ed, for your time today, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, and hope to see you Tuesday and Wednesday.